Moving day was supposed to be a fresh start until my wife found my old journal. Now she looks at me like I'm a stranger, and I don't know if our marriage will ever be the same. Moving day should have been exciting. A fresh start, a new home, a new chapter in our marriage. Instead, it became the moment everything changed. We were sorting through old boxes in the attic when my wife found it, an old, leather-bound journal buried beneath piles of forgotten things. I hadn't seen it in years, and honestly, I had no intention of ever seeing it again. But curiosity got the best of her. She flipped it open, laughing at the idea of getting a glimpse into teenage me. I didn't stop her. Maybe I should have. I was busy sealing up a box when I noticed her silence. That sharp shift in energy, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. She wasn't smiling anymore. She was staring at the pages, her face pale, her fingers gripping the journal too tightly. I walked over, already feeling that deep, instinctual sense of dread. I knew what she was reading. I knew what was in there. And I knew exactly why she looked like she had just uncovered something she was never supposed to see. That journal was from a time in my life I had long buried. A time when I was angry, lost, and filled with thoughts that, in the wrong light, could look terrifying. I had poured everything onto those pages, every resentment, every violent fantasy, every bitter, reckless thought. The things I had never said out loud, the things I had only allowed to live in ink and paper. And now, she was seeing them. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. Did you really think these things? I tried to explain. It was just teenage angst. A way to vent. I never meant any of it. I never acted on any of it. I wasn't that person anymore. But I could see it in her eyes. Doubt. Fear. A part of her wasn't sure she believed me. And that realization was like watching something vital crack between us. That night, she didn't sleep next to me. And I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. She wasn't the same after that. It was subtle at first, like the faintest shift in temperature that you don't notice right away. The way her voice lost its warmth when she spoke to me, the way her fingers lingered at the edge of the kitchen counter as if debating whether to stand closer to me or move further away. Small things. Things I could almost pretend weren't real. But they were. I told myself it was just shock. That she had read something disturbing, and it made sense that she needed time to process it. After all, if I had stumbled across something equally dark about her, wouldn't I need time too? Still, time didn't seem to heal anything. The first real sign of trouble came the next morning. Normally, we had a rhythm. She'd make coffee while I made breakfast, passing each other with easy familiarity. Some mornings, she'd stand behind me and wrap her arms around my waist, pressing her face against my back, murmuring about how much she hated mornings. I lived for those small, domestic moments. They made everything feel right. But today, there was no touch. No warmth. She didn't even look at me. Instead, she moved around me like I was something fragile and unpredictable. Something that might break or explode if she got too close. She wasn't angry. Anger would have been easier. Instead, she was distant, measured, like she was watching me from behind glass. I tried to brush it off, to keep things normal. I kissed her cheek before heading out for the day, and though she let me, it felt like kissing a statue. That night, she didn't sleep next to me. She claimed she wasn't tired, that she had some work to do. But when I woke up in the middle of the night, she still wasn't in bed. I found her on the couch, curled up with a blanket, staring at nothing. I stood there in the doorway, watching her, and it hit me all at once. This wasn't just a phase. This wasn't just an awkward adjustment period. Something had broken. I finally asked her, "Are we going to talk about this?" She hesitated. Just for a second. Then she shook her head. Not now. Not now. That was how it went for the next few days. Not now turned into silence. Into avoidance. Into her lying awake at night while I pretended not to notice. Into stolen glances when she thought I wasn't looking. Into a feeling that settled between us like a wall that neither of us knew how to tear down. I told myself it would pass. That she would come around. That one night, she'd climb back into bed and things would go back to normal. But then, one evening, as I reached for her hand, she flinched. It was barely noticeable, a small, involuntary twitch. But I saw it. I saw it. And that's when I knew. She wasn't just distant. She was scared of me. Fear is a strange thing. It doesn't always announce itself with screams or shaking hands. Sometimes, it's in the quiet moments, in the spaces between words, in the way someone doesn't look at you when they normally would. And my wife, my best friend, my partner, was afraid of me. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, that I was making something out of nothing. But fear has a way of slipping into the smallest cracks, making them impossible to ignore. The night she flinched, I didn't say anything. Neither did she. We just sat there in that awful, suffocating silence. She pulled her hand away as if I had burned her, and then, pretending nothing had happened, she reached for her glass of water and took a sip. I could almost believe I had misread it. Almost. But then I saw the way her throat moved as she swallowed. Too fast, too deliberate. Like she was steadying herself. That was when the dread started. I went to bed that night feeling like an intruder in my own life. Lying next to her, staring at the ceiling, I replayed every moment I could remember, searching for something, anything, that might have planted this fear in her. The journal was disturbing, yes, I could admit that, but it wasn't a confession. It wasn't a blueprint for violence. It was just the ramblings of a bitter, miserable teenager who thought the world was out to get him. Didn't she know that? Didn't she know me? I tried not to let it fester. The next morning, I told myself I'd fix it. I'd bring her coffee. I'd pull her close. I'd remind her, with every small gesture, that she had nothing to fear. But when I walked into the kitchen, I found her already dressed, keys in hand, coat on. "I'm going to my sister's for a few days," she said. It hit me like a slap. "Just a few days," she added, as if that made it better. "I need time to think." Think about what? I wanted to ask, but I didn't, because I already knew the answer. She needed to think about whether she was still safe with me. She left without a kiss, without a proper goodbye, just the dull click of the door closing, and then silence. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the empty space where she had been, feeling something inside me unravel. This wasn't just about an old journal anymore. This was about something deeper, something I had no idea how to fix. And I was terrified that I was about to lose everything. The house was too quiet without her. At first, I told myself it was fine, that she just needed space, that this wasn't the beginning of the end, just a pause. But as the hours stretched into days, the silence grew heavier, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. I kept expecting a message from her, some kind of reassurance that things would be okay. But my phone stayed stubbornly silent, and every time I reached for it, I hesitated. I didn't want to seem desperate. I didn't want to confirm what I was already afraid of. By the third night, sleep became impossible. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the emptiness beside me. My mind kept going back to the journal, flipping through the pages in my memory. I had tried to forget what I had written, but now I found myself reconstructing it piece by piece. The anger, the bitterness, the violent, vengeful fantasies I had poured into those pages. I hadn't been a happy teenager. I had been lonely, resentful, full of rage that had nowhere to go. Writing had been my only outlet, the only way to purge the ugliness that festered inside me. But I had grown past it, hadn't I? The next morning, I forced myself to function. I went to work, answered emails, forced polite conversation when necessary. But beneath it all, my thoughts were circling one question over and over again. What exactly had she read that made her this afraid? I needed to know. I spent that evening tearing through the boxes we hadn't finished unpacking, searching for the damn journal. When I finally found it, my hands were already shaking. I flipped through the pages, scanning the words with fresh eyes. It was worse than I remembered. The words jumped out at me in jagged, angry lines. Fantasies of hurting people who had wronged me. Graphic, violent imagery that even now made my stomach churn. I had written about people I hated. Teachers, classmates, even family members, with a kind of reckless abandon that was nauseating to read as an adult. I didn't recognize this person, and yet, he had once been me. No wonder she was afraid. No wonder she had left. I closed the journal, pressing my palms against my face. My mind was racing. I needed to talk to her. To explain. But how do you explain something like this? How do you convince someone you're not the person you once were when the evidence is right there in black and white? I reached for my phone before I could stop myself. The call rang twice before she answered. She didn't say anything at first. Neither did I. And then, finally, she exhaled. "I was hoping you'd call." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Something careful. I swallowed hard. "Can we talk?" A pause. Then, softly, "Yeah, I think we need to." And just like that, everything was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't predict. I met her at a small cafe, one we used to go to when we first started dating. It wasn't lost on me that she had chosen neutral ground, a place public enough to keep the conversation controlled. It stung, but I understood. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting by the window, fingers wrapped around a cup of tea. Not coffee. Coffee was her usual order. Small details, but they meant something now. She looked up when I approached, and for the first time in days, our eyes met. She didn't look angry. She didn't even look sad. She looked tired. I sat down across from her, my heart pounding. There was no roadmap for this conversation. No easy way to say what needed to be said. I read the journal, I admitted. Her fingers tightened around the cup. She exhaled through her nose, like she had been waiting for this. And I hesitated, then shook my head. I don't know. I don't know what to say. It was worse than I remembered. Her lips pressed into a thin line. It was bad. I nodded. For a long moment, we just sat there, letting the weight of it settle between us. Then, finally, she spoke. I need you to be honest with me. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. When you wrote those things, did you mean them? The question hit me like a slap. I opened my mouth, closed it, then forced myself to answer. At the time? Maybe. Or at least, I thought I did. But I never wanted to actually do anything. I ran a hand through my hair. I was angry. I felt powerless. Writing was the only thing that made me feel in control. She studied me, unreadable. Do you still feel that way? No, the answer was immediate. And true, I haven't felt that way in years. She let out a slow breath. I could see her processing my words, weighing them against the pages she had read. I leaned forward, my voice softer now. You've known me for years. Have I ever given you a reason to be afraid of me? She hesitated, just for a second, but that second felt like a knife to the gut. I don't know, she admitted. I sat back, the words hitting harder than I expected. She wasn't saying she was afraid of me, but she also wasn't saying she wasn't. I never wanted you to see that side of me, I said quietly. Her expression softened, but she didn't reach for my hand. I think that's what scares me the most. The fact that I had no idea. We sat in silence for a long time. Then, finally, she said it. I think we need therapy. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't up for debate. I swallowed, my throat tight. Just me. No, she said. Both of us. And with that, everything changed. This wasn't just about an old journal anymore. This was about us. And whether or not we could still be saved. Therapy wasn't something I had ever considered for myself. It had always seemed like something other people needed. People who had been through real trauma. People who couldn't function. I was fine. My past was in the past. I had moved on. Or at least, that's what I told myself. But now, sitting in the waiting room of a therapist's office, my wife beside me, it felt like something inside me was unraveling. She sat with her hands in her lap, fingers laced together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She wasn't looking at me. It had been a week since our conversation at the cafe. A week of quiet, careful interactions. A week of polite, distant exchanges that made me feel like I was living with a stranger. I kept catching her watching me when she thought I wasn't looking, studying me, as if she was trying to solve a puzzle and wasn't sure she liked the picture forming. I wanted to tell her that she had nothing to be afraid of, that I wasn't the person she had read about in those pages. But words didn't seem enough. The door opened, and the therapist, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a professional smile, gestured us inside. We sat on opposite ends of the couch. Not close, not touching. She spoke first. So, what brings you both here today? My wife hesitated, then exhaled. I found something. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the weight behind it. She was choosing her words carefully. An old journal. From when he was a teenager. The therapist nodded, as if this wasn't the first time she had heard something like this. And what about it made you want to come here? My wife didn't look at me. It scared me. Hearing her say it out loud made my stomach twist. The therapist turned to me. Would you like to respond to that? I forced myself to breathe. I understand why. It was the truth. If I had stumbled upon something like that, if the roles had been reversed, would I have reacted any differently? I wrote it when I was in a dark place. I continued. I never thought anyone would read it. I never meant for anyone to see that part of me. She nodded. But she did. I swallowed. Yeah. She glanced between us. What do you hope to get out of this? I looked at my wife. She finally met my gaze. I want to know I can trust him, she said. My chest ached. I wanted to say, you can. You always could. But trust isn't built with words. It's built with time. And I had no idea if I had enough of it left. Therapy became a place where we unraveled. At first, it was slow, careful, like tiptoeing around something fragile. My wife spoke about her fear in cautious sentences, measuring each word before letting it out. I answered as honestly as I could, but it felt like every response was weighed, analyzed, judged. I hated it. Not because I didn't want to be here, not because I didn't want to fix things, but because I could feel the distance between us solidifying. This wasn't something that could be fixed with a single session. This was going to take time, and I didn't know if time was on my side. But then, in our fourth session, something shifted. She hesitated before speaking, fingers gripping the hem of her sweater. I never told you about what happened when I was younger. I sat up straighter. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at her lap, like she was debating whether or not to say the words at all. The therapist leaned forward slightly. You don't have to share anything you're not ready to. She exhaled, shaking her head. No, I need to. And then she told me. She told me about him. A man from her past. Someone she had trusted. Someone who had hurt her. Someone who had taught her, at a young age, that the people closest to you were the ones who could do the most damage. I sat there, stunned, my heart aching in a way I didn't know was possible. She had never told me. Not once in all our years together. And now, finally, I understood. It wasn't just my journal. It was everything it represented. It was the idea that she had married someone who might not be as safe as she thought. It was the fear that she had let someone into her life who could become like him. It wasn't just about me. It was about her past colliding with mine. I wanted to reach for her, to tell her I was nothing like him, that I would never be like him. But I knew that wouldn't help. Because fear doesn't listen to logic. Fear listens to patterns. And I had unknowingly become part of a pattern she had spent her whole life trying to escape. The therapist gave her space to breathe, to process. I stayed quiet, letting it sink in. And then, finally, she looked at me. Her eyes weren't as cold as they had been before. There was something else there now. Something raw. Something fragile. Maybe even something hopeful. I swallowed hard. I never wanted to hurt you. She nodded. I know. But knowing and believing were two different things. And I wasn't sure which one she was closer to. For days after that session, my mind couldn't let go of what I had learned. I replayed it over and over, dissecting every detail, trying to piece together what it meant. The weight of it sat in my chest, heavy and immovable. She had been hurt before. Someone had broken the foundation of her trust long before I ever met her. And now, somehow, I had cracked it again without even meaning to. I wanted to be angry, but I couldn't be. Not at her. I could only be angry at myself. Not for what I had written in that journal. I had made peace with that. But for never seeing the signs. For never knowing that the woman I loved had been carrying this kind of pain long before she ever found mine. It made me wonder what else I had missed. For so many years, I had thought of my past as something separate, something I had left behind. I had told myself that what I wrote didn't matter, because it had never been real. But to her, it was real. It was evidence that I had once been capable of darkness. I stood in front of the mirror, studying my own reflection as if it held some kind of answer. I looked the same as I always had. Same face, same eyes, same skin. But for the first time, I wondered if maybe I had never really outrun the person I used to be. Maybe I had just buried him. And maybe, just maybe, she had been right to be afraid. I spent the night on the couch, staring at the ceiling, sleep refusing to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face when she had told me the truth. The tension in her shoulders, the careful way she had spoken. I had spent all this time thinking I was the one being judged, but now I realized I had never truly seen her either. This wasn't just about proving that I was safe. This was about proving that I could see her, that I could understand the fears she had never spoken aloud. But I didn't know if it was too late. Morning came, and I was exhausted. She moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, and for the first time in days, I hesitated before reaching for my coffee. I waited, watching her, searching for any sign of warmth. Nothing. She wasn't avoiding me, not like before. But she wasn't letting me in, either. I didn't speak. Not yet. I needed to be careful now. Every word mattered. Every action would tell her more than anything I could say. For the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if love was enough. And that terrified me more than anything I had ever written. The silence between us had changed. It wasn't filled with tension anymore, not like before. But it also wasn't comfortable. It was something else, something heavier. Like we were both waiting for something to happen, for one of us to say the right thing or the wrong thing. The days blurred together. I focused on work, on keeping my mind occupied, but I could feel the weight of her presence even when we weren't in the same room. She wasn't pulling away anymore, but she wasn't reaching for me either. I watched her more closely now, noticing things I had never noticed before. The way she hesitated before speaking. The way her shoulders tensed when I walked into the room, only to relax when she realized I wasn't angry. I had never realized how much she braced for impact, as if she had spent her life preparing for things to go wrong. I wanted to fix it. I wanted to erase the fear, to remind her who I was, who I had always been. But I didn't know how. One night, I found myself standing outside our bedroom door, hesitating before opening it. She was already in bed, curled up on her side, facing away from me. For a moment, I thought about turning around, sleeping on the couch again. But that wasn't the answer. Avoiding her wouldn't change anything. I slid into bed slowly, careful not to disturb her. The space between us felt like miles. I stared at the ceiling, heart pounding. Are you okay? She didn't answer at first. But then, So quietly I almost didn't hear it. I don't know. That was the moment I realized we couldn't keep going like this. This wasn't something we could just push past. Something had to give. Something had to change. Because if it didn't, I was going to lose her. And I couldn't let that happen. Something had shifted after that night. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both felt it. The weight of everything we had left unsaid was crushing us. I woke up to find her already out of bed. She had been doing that a lot lately, waking up early, leaving the room before I stirred. It was another form of distance, another quiet way of keeping space between us. But that morning was different. I found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold. I sat across from her, waiting. She exhaled. I don't know if I can move past this. The words hit harder than I expected, even though I had been bracing for them. I swallowed, forcing myself to stay calm. What do you need from me? She finally met my gaze. There was no anger in her eyes, no resentment, just exhaustion. I don't know. Neither did I. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let this break us. For the first time since this all started, I wasn't focused on proving that I wasn't dangerous. I wasn't scrambling to convince her that I was still the same man she had always known. That wasn't enough. I needed to show her that I understood, that I could listen, that I could change, that I could be the person she needed, not just the person I thought I was. I want to do whatever it takes, I said. Her fingers tightened around the coffee mug. It's not just about the journal. It's about everything. I nodded. I know. A long silence stretched between us. But this time, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like something else. A beginning. Maybe we weren't fixed. Maybe we never would be. But we were trying. And for now, that had to be enough.